Good morning. I hope you brought your change today. We're going to be taking that noisy offering at the end of the service today. And when we do that, the children will be coming in right at the very end. So when I'm done preaching, don't leave yet. We'll have them take the offering. And they're going to sing a song for us. And if it's your child that's here, we're going to keep them up front. We're going to ask you parents or grandparents to come up front to get your children when the service is done. Also, we've been in our membership drive, and a number of you have been signing up, expressing an interest in membership. It's been exciting. 17 of you so far have said, hey, I'm interested in becoming a member of Trinity Wesleyan. So that's really cool. And we have different orientation meetings for you to come in and kind of hear what that's about and decide, all right, am I going to do this? So our first orientation meeting is today, and I think there's about 12 of you that signed up to come to today's orientation. So if you're doing that, when the service is over, you have to give me a couple minutes to be able to get out. But my office is right outside these double doors right there, and we're going to meet in my office right after the morning service. I'm going to ask you to take your Bibles and turn, if you would, to Mark chapter 2, the second chapter of the Gospel of Mark. I wonder how many of you are like me in this sense. Now, I'm old. I'm 57, so I'm old. But if you have, when you grew up, you're telling on yourself if you're really laughing at me, but yeah, I know, I'm just a baby. Growing up, I always went to church. Probably the first weekend home from the hospital, I was in church. But in my folks' home, the rule was we're going to church. It doesn't matter what. There's no debate. It wasn't this deal, well, where the kids don't really like it. No, my parents picked the church, and they were like, that's where we're going. There's no argument. I mean, if short of maybe having a bone sticking out of my leg or running a fever of 105, there's no excuses. You're going. That's just, does anybody else have that when you're going? I mean, it was just, you are there. I mean, if we had company come over, it wasn't, well, we stayed home because we had company. They don't go. No, if you were going to come and visit our home and stay here, you're going to church with us. Otherwise, don't come. I mean, it was just kind of the way that it was. But today, it's not the case that way. Things have really changed. Our country has changed significantly, and I was doing some research on statistics. And the church in North America, all denominations, is declining. People are not going anymore. And even with those who are going, this was the statistic I found interesting, that those who are regularly involved and committed to a church are going less and less. So statistics have showed if a family used to go 4 times a month, now they're only going 3 times a month. Or if a family went twice a month, they're only going once a month. And if they went once a month, they're only going about a half a dozen times a year. And that is all across the boards. That's every denomination. That applies to the mega churches. It applies to the large churches, mid-sized churches, and small churches. It's a phenomena within our country, and it just verifies, I think, that the human tendency that humans tend to shift from one extreme to the other extreme, which is maybe one of the reasons why history repeats itself. Because when I was a kid, we thought of Sunday as Sabbath. And I mean, today's not actually the Sabbath. Sabbath's on Saturday. But in our church world, we made the Sabbath Sunday. And in our world, Sunday as a kid was a drag. I mean, it was a drudgery because we had to get up early in the morning. We had to get dressed. And that day, the attire was suit and tie. I had to put on a suit as a little 8-year-old kid. I'm putting on a tie and a suit. And the girls all had to wear dresses. We had to dress them, get ready. And we had to get that whole crowd to church in the morning. And we'd sit down and we'd listen to that sermon. And then when that sermon was done and church was over, we'd go home, have a big family dinner. And then when that was done, we'd have to, read maybe brochures or read something about the faith, maybe take a nap, which isn't bad. I wish we could do that still. We'd have to do that. But then about 4 or 5 o'clock, you'd get ready again, and you'd have to do the whole thing over again on Sunday night. You had to go on Sunday night, and then you had to go on Wednesday night. And so, church just became an absolute drudgery, all right? But today, it's just the opposite. In fact, many people miss church precisely because of other things they want to do. Because when I was a kid, you couldn't play sports, you couldn't go swimming, you couldn't engage in recreation, you couldn't do any of that kind of stuff. But now today, it's like Sunday is the day for sports. So it's completely switched around the other way. And we tend to get into either one ditch or the other ditch. We tend as people to either be legalistic about the Sabbath, as it was when I was younger, or we tend to be neglectful of the Sabbath. We shift from one extreme to the other, which is really sad because the Sabbath laws weren't meant to enslave us. God's the one that created the Sabbath, and his intention in creating that was to set us free. The Sabbath was meant to be a gift to his people, but it's gotten out of balance. And That's what we're going to read about in our story that we're going to be looking at today. In the end of Mark chapter 2, right beginning at verse 23, we're going to read 12 verses all the way through chapter 3, verse 6. All right. So chapter 2, verse 23 says, "And it came about that he was passing through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples began to make their way along while picking the heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, 'See here, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?' And he said to them, 'Oh, have you never read what David did when he was in need and became hungry, he and his companions? How he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar, the high priest, and ate the consecrated bread, which is not lawful for anyone to eat except the priests. And he gave it also to those who were with him. And he was saying to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Consequently, the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath.' And he entered again into a synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand. And they were watching him to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath, in order that they might accuse him. And he said to the man with the withered hand, 'Rise up, come forward.' And he said to them, 'Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save a life or to kill?' But they kept silent. And after looking around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, he said to the man, 'Stretch out your hand.' And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored. And the Pharisees went out and immediately began taking counsel with the Herodians against him as to how they might destroy him." Now, Mark pieces these two stories together. You know, the disadvantage of having Bibles with chapters and verse divisions is that we sometimes segregate things in our minds that the authors never intended. When Mark wrote, there were no verse numbers, there were no chapter numbers, it was just all on one long scroll. But we often see the end of chapter 2 as the end of that story, and the beginning of chapter 3 is the beginning of a whole brand new story, but they're not. Mark puts these two episodes together intentionally because he wants to tell us something through these two episodes. And what he's doing is he's actually contrasting two different kinds of people. The heart of a person who has a true relationship with God is one that we see here, and then the heart of a person who is practicing empty religion. And so we're going to examine both of those today as we're going to look at this story. But even before we do that, we've got to pull some details out of the story. This was written almost 2,000 years ago in a different culture, a different time, different customs, different language. And so there's a lot of gaps sometimes that we got to fill in. So I just want to go through some of these verses a little more closely to fill in those gaps because it'll help us to have some takeaways here in just a few minutes. So if you look back in verse 23, you notice that it's the Sabbath, and the disciples are walking through a field with Jesus, and they're picking the heads of grain, and they're rubbing them, and they're eating them. So this isn't their field. They're trekking from one location to another. They're hungry. So it's a wheat field, so they just pick off the head of grain, and they're rubbing them to get the kernels of wheat, and they're eating those. And the Pharisees see this, and they're upset by it. Now, the law said that was okay to do. That was not illegal. In fact, we won't look there, but Deuteronomy 23:26 gives us that law, that you can go to the edge of a neighbor's grain field, and you can pick and you can eat. What they didn't want you doing was taking a sickle and harvesting your neighbor's grain, because then you'd be stealing. But it was a provision that was made for the poor and those in need, that they could go along the edge and they could rub the grain. So that's what they were doing. But the problem comes in verse 24, as the Pharisees say, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? And that was the sticking point. They were doing it on the Sabbath, and that was considered work. You don't work on the Sabbath. And you see what happened, the Pharisees and the scribes and the Sadducees, the religious hierarchy, down through the ages, had taken the laws of Moses and they had written other laws to them. So when the law said, thou shalt do no work on the Sabbath day, thou shalt honor the Sabbath day and keep it holy, they asked the question, what is work? What's not work? And they started writing other laws. And so they said, well, if you pick grain from the top of a piece of wheat or a wheat stalk, that's fine. But if you rub it, that's considered winnowing, and so that's work. So you can pick it, but you can't do this. And so they had all these little intricate laws. And so they were saying, you're working, by doing this, you're working on the Sabbath. And that's what they did not like. So Jesus responds back in verses 25 and 26 with the story. He says, don't you remember David? Now, some of you may not know who David was, but David was the very first king, or no, he was the second king of Israel, but he was considered Israel's greatest king. But David came to the throne under his father-in-law Saul, and his father-in-law Saul hated David and wanted to destroy him. So was hunting him down to kill him, because Saul eventually wanted his actual son Jonathan to become king, but God had anointed David and told Saul, I'm getting rid of you because you're not obeying me. So there's several years there where Saul's hunting David down. Well, on one particular day, David is running for his life with his men, his band of soldiers that are with him, and they come to the village that's a priestly village. There's 70 priests living in this village. And he goes into where the tabernacle is. It's not in Jerusalem at this time. It didn't exist at that point. It's not a big temple. It's just a tent, a tabernacle. And he asked the high priest, Abiathar, do you have any food? And he said, all we have is the food on the table of showbread. Well, what that was is for ceremonial purposes, they had a table where they would put loaves of bread, 12 loaves of bread, like little pancakes, on this table. And that was to be used for worship. But it was not, and the only ones who could eat it would be the high priest and the other priests. The people could not eat it. So he said, that's all I've got. But he said, you're hungry, you need food. I know we're not supposed to do this, but here, take the food. So David took it and he fed his men. And so what Jesus is saying is that, look, your King David, the great patriarch of the Jewish people, he broke the rules by giving showbread to his men. And when we read in the Old Testament, let's see, it's in Exodus, it says that the showbread was only placed on the table on the day of the Sabbath. So all the rest of the week, there would be no bread on that table. And as soon as it was placed, shortly after, there would be a ceremony and the priest would eat it. So the fact that the bread is sitting on the table but hasn't been eaten yet tells us that this is the Sabbath day. So David's fleeing on the Sabbath. They break the law on the Sabbath. He eats that food on the Sabbath. And Jesus now is comparing himself to David. And he's comparing his disciples to David's mighty men. And he's saying that David was able to break that rule, and you guys are okay with it because you think David's the greatest thing that's ever been. Well, that's what's happening here in this situation. And then if you move on in verse 27, it says that he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man. In other words, the Sabbath was a creation that God gave. God created the world, it says in Genesis, in 6 days, and the seventh day he rested. And after doing that, he said that there was a law that came out under Moses many years later that referred back to that and said, because God rested on the seventh day, then you're to work 6 days and you're going to rest on the seventh day, and it's going to be a day of worship for you. And so God instituted what's called the Sabbath. But it was made for man. It wasn't intended to be a handcuff that man is serving it. It was intended to serve man. And then Jesus makes this statement, consequently, the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. So he's saying that God made it and the Son of Man is Lord of it. In other words, what Jesus is saying is, I'm the one that made the Sabbath law. I'm the one who was back there at the time of Moses. I'm the one that was back there at the time of creation. I'm Lord of the Sabbath. So if I want to change the rules a little bit, I am completely in my rights to do that because I created the thing in the first place. That's what he's saying to them. Now, when you get down to verse 1 of chapter 3, it says, and he entered again into the synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand. St. Jerome, one of the early church fathers, tells us in his writings that this guy was a mason. He laid stone. And in the Gospel of Luke, it says it was his right hand that was withered. And the language in Mark, in Greek, words it in such a way that this happened to the guy. In other words, he wasn't born this way. There was either an accident or he got sick. So this is a stonemason who is, and everybody was right-handed in that day. You know, they didn't let you be left-handed because that was considered bad and odd. And so if there was a left-handed person, that was a real peculiarity. They forced you, I don't know if you remember this, but 50, 60 years ago, if kids were born with left-handed, they made them become right-handed. You remember that, some of you? And so he's right-handed. So when he becomes sick or crippled, he can't work anymore. There's no welfare system. You know, there's no unemployment. So he can't provide for his family. So this man is suffering from the hand, but he also is suffering the fact that he can't work for his family. So then in verse 2 it says, and they were watching him to see if he would heal him. That's amazing to me because it does not say they were watching to see if he could heal him. They were watching to see if he would. They knew he could. They watched his power over and over. They saw him heal. They saw him work miracles. So what's amazing to me in this is they know he has the power of God. He can do all of that stuff, but none of that matters. They want to see if he would do it. Why? Because they want to accuse him. This guy is a trap. They're setting up a trap for Jesus. And so then it says, he said to the man with the withered hand, rise up and come forward. That's interesting too. The guy doesn't ask to be healed. Jesus is in the synagogue, and he initiates this thing. He brings it to the surface. He doesn't allow this thing to stay hidden. He's poking the bear again. That's what Jesus always did with the religious leaders. And he calls the man out and actually brings the man front and center. And it says, and he said to them, meaning to the Pharisees, so the man's front and center, but he's talking to the Pharisees. It says, he said to them, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good, which is what Jesus wants to do, or to do harm, which is what they want to do, to save a life, which is what Jesus is going to do, because this guy can't even provide for his family, or to kill, which is what they want to do, because they want to get rid of him. And it says they kept silent. They knew the answer. The answer was, well, obviously, on the Sabbath, you're going to do good. But they're not going to answer him. They're not going to concede to that, because they have a plan. They want to destroy his life. So they're going to play that little political game. I think it's interesting that when Mark tells the story of King David in chapter 2, there's two words in verse 25 that he uses I think is interesting. He says that David was in need and David became hungry. So they were in need and they were hungry. And then here in verse 4 of chapter 3, it talks about saving a life and it talks about doing good. So need and hunger, saving a life, doing good. So they're breaking the Sabbath rules for those purposes. And this is what that tells me, that human need supersedes laws. That the law of love, the spirit of the law, is more important than the letter of the law. In fact, in Matthew's gospel, in chapter 12, and I'll just flip there real quick, verse 7, Matthew tells this very same story, but he adds something to Jesus' statement. And this is what Jesus said there. But if you had known what this means, I desire compassion and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. So he's saying, it's not about sacrificial laws and obeying all of the rules. It's about mercy. It's about compassion. It's about doing good. It's about helping. That supersedes all of these laws. So that's what he's getting at here. And then it says, and after looking around at them with anger, so Jesus is angry. Jesus is God, so God is angry. And some people say, man, why would Jesus? That's not Jesus. Jesus doesn't get angry. He's meek and mild and loves everybody and he's so kind and all. No, Jesus got angry. In Ephesians it says, be angry and sin not. Do not let the sun go down on your anger and do not give the devil a foothold. So in Ephesians, Paul's saying you can be angry, just don't sin in your anger. So righteous anger, an anger that you don't react in a sinful way. And then he says, and don't let the sun go down on it. If you hold a grudge and you're hanging on to that, the devil gets a little foothold in your life and he starts working inside of you. But to be angry with a righteous anger, that's fully legitimate because that's what Jesus is doing here. And so God is getting angry. And the question is, what is it that makes God angry? Well, what makes God angry is the lack of compassion for those in need. That's why on another occasion we see Jesus getting a whip and turning over the tables of the money changers and driving them out of the temple with great anger because those who were in control were taking advantage in a money exchange scheme to manipulate the poor, take advantage of them, and that made Jesus angry. And so after looking around, he was angry, and he said to the man, stretch out your hand, and he stretched it out, and it was restored. Here's the cool thing. Jesus never touched him. He never did and rubbed oil on him. He never did anything to say he's working. He just said, stretch out your hand, and the miracle happened. So they couldn't accuse Jesus of working on the Sabbath in that particular situation. And it says, and the Pharisees went on immediately and began taking counsel with the Herodians, which is crazy because the Pharisees hate the Herodians. The Herodians were the followers of Herod. Herod the Great, that king that everybody hates. I mean, he had all the babies slaughtered in Ramoth of Gilead, and you read that in the Christmas story. And Herod is a title. There's many Herods. So these are followers of his way, and the Pharisees hated them. But politics makes strange bedfellows. If we've both got common enemies, somehow we'll come together. And the reason they want to get together is because they want to destroy Jesus. And that's what it says. They want to look at how they might destroy him. So that's some of the background of that story. Now, I think there's a couple of takeaways from this as we think about having a relationship with God or having an empty religion. So I want to look at those that have an empty religion first. We'll look at the Pharisees first. And I want you to notice a couple of things about them. The first one is this: the Pharisees turned the gift of the Sabbath into a drudgery. I mean, there were so many laws associated with the Sabbath, you couldn't do anything. I mean, here's a stupid law that they wrote. If you spit on the ground during the Sabbath and your spit hits a rock, no problem. But if your spit hits the dirt, it mixes with the dirt, and you're mixing mortar. That's work. You can't spit on the dirt on the Sabbath. That was one of their laws that they had. So it was just ridiculous. So when God instituted this law, think about this. Put yourself in the frame of mind of those who received this law. Moses is on the top of the mountain receiving the Ten Commandments. He comes down to the nation of Israel and he presents the Ten Commandments, and this is one of them, to honor the Sabbath day. It's about resting. He's speaking to people who have been slaves for 450 years. They've known nothing but working every single day, 7 days a week, every day of the year, from before sunrise till after sunset, until they drop dead. There's no rest. And if you don't keep up the amount of work, you're whipped and you're beaten until you either get in line or you die. So when these people hear, I want you to take one day and set it aside for worship and rest, they're like, this is awesome, because they never knew that before. And now they're getting an opportunity built into their laws that they are guaranteed a time of rest. And so, Sabbath is about resting spiritually through worship and through sacrament. Sabbath is about resting physically through recreation, through physical rest, through family. It's a gift because it reconnects us with God. It keeps us connected with family and friends. It recharges us emotionally and mentally and physically. But when we get in the ditches where the Sabbath either becomes neglected or it becomes a drudgery, then we end up turning a relationship with God into an empty religion. We're just going through the motions or not doing it at all. Here's the second thing. The Pharisees were closed to the Word of God because it didn't fit their desired narrative. Can you imagine this? Standing right in front of them is the living Word teaching them about the written Word. He's telling them about David. So you got the guy that actually inspired it, as all of these authors wrote it. And he's teaching them about it, and they are not getting a thing that he said. They would not listen because it didn't fit their plan. When we open our Bibles but close our hearts, we turn our relationship with God into an empty religion. Number 3, the Pharisees were blinded to the hurts of others. They didn't care one bit about this crippled man. He was just a pawn, a tool. They didn't care if he was healed or not. They cared more about their religious system than they did about the crippled man. Well, when the focus becomes more about caring for ourselves or our traditions, more than meeting the needs of the hurting, we've turned our relationship with God into an empty religion. Number 4, the Pharisees failed to see their own sin because they were looking so hard at the sins of others. The Pharisees accused Jesus of breaking the Sabbath. But they are working on the Sabbath overtime. They're orchestrating, they're setting stuff up, they're hunting Jesus down. They're working on the Sabbath, doing the very thing that they're accusing Jesus of doing. Well, when someone is ready to point out the flaws of others, they've turned their relationship with God into an empty religion. And then finally, the Pharisees hung around Jesus, but they didn't know him. The Pharisees were in the field with Jesus, and they heard him teach. And they were in the synagogue with Jesus, and they saw him heal, but they didn't know him. You can worship. You can go to church fellowships. You can volunteer for programs, and yet not know the Lord. And that's empty religion. How completely different is Jesus? When you look at Jesus in these two stories, you just see such a change. For example, and I'll just give you a couple things here. First, Jesus cared about people with regular needs. He cared about the fact that his disciples were hungry enough to technically break the law and let them do this winnowing on the Sabbath. He cared about them, and he cares about your troubles too, even if they're not big ones. He cares about that. Jesus said in his Sermon on the Mount, why do you worry about what you're going to eat and what clothing you're going to wear? Why do you worry about that? Look at the fields. The fields are arrayed with flowers that are so beautiful. They're grander than anything that Solomon ever had. And if God cares about the flowers of the field that are here today and they're gone tomorrow, how much more is he going to care about you? So why worry about what you're going to eat and what you're going to drink and what you're going to do and all of that? You're just so wrapped up in your stuff. And he said, but God cares about you. In fact, he cares so much about you, he knows actually how many hairs are on your head. And for some of you, that number changes really frequently. So he's doing the subtraction, and he keeps up with it, right? He knows all of that. A person who has a relationship with God cares about human needs. He cares about the hunger of others, about the jobs of others, about people being in safety instead of being at risk, about life. Here's the second thing. Jesus cares about people with huge setbacks, like this man with the crippled hand. When he got into the synagogue, he didn't wait. Immediately, he's acting and bringing this guy in front. He does it because he cares for him. And he also cares about our disabilities and our injuries and our illnesses and our financial woes and our family turmoil. A person who has a relationship with God cares about the hurting and gets involved to try and make a difference. Reaching out to the hungry, the oppressed, the marginalized is important to them, because it's important to Jesus. In James chapter 2, verse 14, James makes this amazing statement. He says, "What use is it, my brethren, if a man says he has faith, but he has no works? Can that faith save him? If a brother or sister is without clothing and in need of daily food, and one of you says to them, 'Go in peace, be warmed, and be filled,' and yet you do not give them what is necessary for their body, what use is that? But you believe," what you say, "even so, faith, if it has no works, is dead, being by itself." So they care enough to get involved. Here's number 3, Jesus, and the final one. Jesus cared about the Pharisees. These are his enemies. They want to destroy him, but he cares about them. He's angry, but it says he was angered, and then the very next word says that he had compassion on them. He grieved because he cared about their hearts. Their hearts were hardened. A person who has a relationship with God and not just an empty religion is grieved by a church that is interested in its budget, its traditions, or its facilities more than they are interested in being the hands and the voice of Jesus. And so, what kind of person are you? Are you a legalist who focuses on the rules more than you do mercy? Are you closed to being stretched in new ways? Are you blinded to the hurts of people in society? Are you quick to point out the flaws in others? Are you very familiar with church life but don't really know the Lord? Or on the other hand, do you care about the hurts of the poor, the oppressed, the immigrant, the minority? Do you put love and mercy above rules? Do you set aside time each week to worship God and to rest and recreate so that you can get to actually know him? Only you can answer that question. But what I want us to do in a few moments here before the children come in and sing to us is just pause and reflect for a moment. I want to pray a prayer, and I'm going to ask you to just perhaps bow your head and think about your own heart and bring this prayer before God. It's a prayer that David wrote. He said, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there be some hurtful way in me, and lead me to the path of everlasting life." Lord, search us. You know our hearts. You know our motives. You know what's really going on, not the story we tell ourselves or the image that we present to others. You know what's really going on inside of our hearts. So search us. Lord, try us and know our anxious thoughts. You know the anxieties and the turmoils and the struggles that we have inside, the worries and the fears. You know every bit of it. See if there be some hurtful way in me. Lord, look in me, and is there something that's harmful? Is there a bitterness in me? Is there a cynicism in me? Is there an apathy in me? Is there a hatred in me? Is there unforgiveness in me? Lord, if there's something that's hurtful in me, Lord, search it and bring it to the surface and lead us to the path of everlasting life. Lead us to the place, Lord, where there's healing and there's restoration and there's strengthening of a real relationship and not just a religion. We pray it in the name of Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior. Amen. And now the children are going to come on in. They're already coming. Hi. And this offering that we're going to take, I hope you got your money. A noisy offering. Our purpose is to raise money to help needy children around the world who cannot get an education if they're not sponsored. So this will actually help send children in third world countries to school. So the children are collecting money through the summer to send away, and we just wanted to help them out one of these Sundays. So when we take our offering, they're going to sing for you.